But we're really excited to have tonight's guest with us, Quinn Jacobson. Quinn is an internationally known artist and educator who specializes in the wet plate collodion process for the last 20 years. While living in Germany between 2006 and 2011, he has been instrumental in reviving the process in Europe. He has published 4 books on the wet plate collodion process and has had several major exhibitions in Brussels, Belgium, London, England, Barcelona, Spain, Paris and France, Shanghai, China, and throughout America. Holding an undergraduate degree in photography, communication, and visual art from Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, and a Master of Fine Arts in Historic Photographic Processes from Goddard College in Plainfield, Vermont, we are very lucky to have him with us live all the way from Colorado, Quinn Jacobson. Welcome, Quinn.
Hey, thanks, John. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate the invite. I am excited to share a little bit of work with you tonight.
I don't know if we've ever talked about this because the way I discovered your work when I started getting into wet plate photography, I'd worked in the darkroom a lot, and when I first started looking into wet plate photography, I will tell you that you scared the hell out of me.
Oh yeah, how's that?
Because you were talking about having your blood, you had your blood tested just to make sure you weren't having any problems with these chemicals, right?
That's true. Yes, I talked about that often, and over the years, definitely, yes.
So you scared me with that, but I had darkroom experience, so I wasn't really worried about that. But the problem is, you scared the hell out of me, and then I saw John Coffer, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, Quinn's got this amazing darkroom set up, and that's just way too much. And then I see John Coffer mixing chemicals with chickens running around.
Yeah.
So I figure, okay, I think I'm okay as long as I kind of follow somewhere in the middle. I figured I would be okay.
Right, and I talk about, and I've talked about that over the years, like you've mentioned. I primarily talk about the cadmium that I use in the process, the cadmium bromide, the heavy metal, and then doing daguerreotypes. I did daguerreotypes for a few years, and the mercury, I used hot mercury, and when I had my blood panel done every year for my physical, I'd have a heavy metal test, a cadmium test and a mercury test, just to make sure that I was mitigating or taking care of those problems and not exposing too much. I never did anything on ether exposure and those kinds of things. More of a, constant, just good ventilation, constant ventilation. So those are the two blood concerns I had, and I was always good over the years. And like you just said, almost 20 years of doing this, I haven't had any health problems from it. So cross my fingers, knock on wood.
Quinn, what we're going to do is I want to go through your presentation, which is fantastic. Sure. I also want to tell people again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about you because you've been a definite inspiration to me because I love how you think of the bigger picture. And my thought was, there's a lot of people that they click a button and they print something and they slap it on a wall. But the problem is there's so much you can do. And while we're going to see that you have done so much to and we're going to talk about this because I've got a million questions if you don't bring it up. We found out that you've mixed a lot of things into your alternative process in order to get the final print. I love that, and I want our Camera Club members and our guests to see this and understand that they can do that, even though 99.9% of them are digital photographers.
Sure. Yeah, and that'll be great because I think, part of these, and I do quite a few of these actually. I do this kind of partly for, I do local colleges and universities here, and I travel. Now we have the virus going around. All my stuff is canceled this month, but this month I was going up to do a William Henry Jackson presentation in Nebraska here on their 100th anniversary of Scotts Bluff, the national park system there. So I do this a lot, and one of my, I just don't do it for wet collodion photographers or historic process photographers. I do it for people interested, even if they don't work in photography at all, but digital photographers, film photographers, anybody, any creators, sculptors, painters, musicians, anybody that's interested in creating, and you bring up the good points there, that if we dive into these ideas a little more, even beyond the medium, I try to share what I've done as inspiration and possible ideas for other people to work on their own projects and think about their own projects in a more unique way. And that's kind of the gist of what yes, the photographs are important, the stories are important. My stories, I think, should be interesting to some people, But the overall concept is to get people excited about creating whatever medium you use and whatever. If you sculpt, if you paint, if you use digital photography, film photography, historic processes, it really doesn't matter. Creating is the ultimate goal here, and ideas around what you create and why you create is what I'm most interested in.
Well, Quinn, I can't think of a better person to drive that point home. Let's get started on your presentation. I really want everyone to think about it. Think about, and like you said, you couldn't have said it any better. You want everybody to be excited enough about photography that you try to take it to the next level beyond a button and a print.
Sure.
When you're ready, we have your presentation up on the screen. Whenever you're ready, go ahead, and we'll keep comments and questions for the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, I thank you for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. I like to, not that I like to blow my own horn, so to speak, but I do like to share these ideas, and I do like to share what I've done. This is kind of John inspired me over the last couple of weeks here when he invited me to your club here to talk a little bit about my work. Over the years, I do these presentations, but I just never published anything online. So this last Sunday, I went ahead and for my little group of people that follow and people that kind of join in with me sometimes, I went ahead and did an artist presentation that you're going to see right now. So again, thank you for having me tonight, and I appreciate the invite, and we can go ahead and get started. My name is Quinn Jacobson. Like John said, he gave you a little intro there about some of my background, my education, my travels. I have worked in wet collodion for almost 20 years now. You'll hear my story here of how I got started in it and what I've done with it over the years. So we could just jump to the next one there, John.
Excellent.
I start out these presentations with this kind of little comment. This is from my thesis, my MFA thesis. I say I like to think that I live in a centric place somewhere between pessimism and optimism. I don't have any big dreams of changing the world with my art, but I do believe art can change the world. I know that sounds cliche, but you're going to see as I present this some of my ideas about having people think about my concepts and how I've used photography, this particular type of photography, and why I use it. But I know most people don't care if I make photographs. They don't care about the work I do. I'm a realist that way. But for those that do care and spend the time to look at my work and think about it and listen to me, I think most people will find something resonates with them. So could we go to the next one? Thank you. I do have some graphic content as far as some of the verbiage. Some of the ideas might be disturbing a little bit. There's nothing explicit that way, but I do deal with genocide and death and murder and things like that. And so I just want to make sure that people know that where we're going with this. So next, please. I'd like to start out with my curriculum vitae or my resume. I just kind of go over this and talk about. I got started in photography in the military. I was in the military from 1982 to 1988. I was an infantryman, a mortarman for 3 years, and I was a combat photographer for 3 years. After the military, I got out and I went to undergraduate school and did my degree in photography, journalism, and visual art, communication and journalism. That was in Utah. And then I started working as a photojournalist for newspapers and magazines. And around the turn of the century, I started looking back and wanting to do something different. And I started working on my project called Portraits from Madison Avenue, which you'll see here shortly right after this. Went ahead and worked through my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts degree at Goddard College in Vermont, and I did my first solo exhibition in this process in Art Access Gallery in Salt Lake City. A wonderful lady named Ruth Lubbers gave me the opportunity. It was the first collodion show that I'd known about in the last 20 or 30 years anyway in the States. And so it was a special show, and it was a unique show, and I'm glad she gave me that opportunity. I had the chance to move to Europe in 2006, and I started working on a project on the Holocaust for the show, and you'll see about this in a minute. I had the solo exhibition in Paris, France. I had a 4-year contract with a gallery called Santaré in the center of Paris. Pierre Gasson represented me for 4 years there, and I worked through two different shows there. Moved back to the States in 11. And also in 2010, you see that little line there in honor of Archer. I was able to put together a group of clothing photographers in about 13 countries and 50 photographers, and put a placard on the guy that invented this wet plate floating process. Was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery, wasn't recognized for anything. Dug up his stone, found that he's there buried with his sister and his brother, and we went ahead and put a placard on his grave, had a little exhibition, and did this whole kind of ceremony in 2010 for him. So I was really honored to be involved in that and do that while I was there. Moved back to the States in 2011, moved to Denver, Colorado here, and I started a project called the American West Portraits. I was born and raised in the West here. I was born in Utah. The American West is a unique place to me. Looking at the place from a unique perspective, living abroad for 5 years, I came back and did basically a body of work on portraits of unique people from the West, and you'll see that in a minute. In 2000, I showed that in Paris in 2012, and then came back in 2013. After that show was over, came back to the States and started working on Ghost Dance, Native American Massacre Site. You'll see my work, and I'll describe this, you'll see my work deals with marginalized communities, otherness, people in the margins of our communities, and the questions I have surrounding some of that stuff. 2014, I was invited by the China Art Academy, the largest art academy in China, in Hangzhou, China, to open the Clothing Collective Asia. So my wife and I went over there for about 3 weeks and got to open that collective up. Give some seminars. We had an exhibition in the art gallery, and I got to meddle around in Shanghai and meet some of the photographers there. It was a very interesting experience. And then just last year, I released my final and last book, a limited edition book of my Chemical Pictures book, with some of my Ghost Dance work in it. So that's kind of I just wanted to give you some context about who I am, my background, and what I've done, so you have some context about what I'm about to show you. So next slide, please. This is how I break down. Now, this is not gospel. This is how I see photography and how I kind of put words around it. So we're kind of all talking the same, using the same vernacular, the same words. I see commercial photography, which is great. If you can make your living doing that, that is a wonderful thing. It's to make money. It's usually directed by someone else. You have creativity in it, but it's usually directed by someone else and you get paid for it. Documentary and photojournalism, which I worked in a lot for many years, you primarily make money with that, and you're telling stories that most of the time you're not personally connected to that work. The assignments are kind of given to you, but it's still enjoyable. You're still telling stories and getting that stuff out there, and that's great. And then there's fine artwork, and this is the perspective I come from. The fine art, how I define fine art, is personal work not intended to make money, meaning that this is work that you do regardless of your income or sales or anything else. This is work that you're driven to do, and for reasons I'll talk about personally about my work. So next slide. This is how I define fine art photography. Exploring personal questions, ideas, concerns through photography with no commercial aspirations, no goals of making money. It's okay if you do, but that's not the intention of it. And then being able to defend the work through context and intention. Exemplary gratis statements, e.g. statements, meaning that you write a brief statement giving the context and intention why the work was made. And ultimately, you're trying to tell important or raise important social and political truths as you see them, and creating a catalyst or a way to have discourse or talk about those ideas. And really, I always say this, my work raises questions. I have questions. I don't necessarily have answers. And I think good work makes people think about things. They don't necessarily answer questions and tie a little bow on them and all that. It's mostly to raise conversation or discourse and dialogue. And then I do believe people, creators of any work, it doesn't matter photography, sculpture, painting, music, whatever you're doing, I believe the creator or the maker of the work should be able to talk about it. Why was it made? What's the intention behind the work? And what's the context of the work? And so that kind of, I hope that lays out some of the, literally some of the context about what I'm about to show you and the ideas that I'm going to present to you, and I hope it makes sense. So next slide, please. Some of my influences in no particular order here. There are writers, philosophers, filmmakers, photographers. If people had to ask me who and what am I inspired by, there's some names and some ideas there. And that's just a quick off the top of my head list of people that influenced me over the years. Next slide, please. So these are my projects, basically from the last 20 years. I'm just shy of that, but close enough, a couple of decades. And I just want to quickly go through these and share these with you, and then I can answer some questions at the end. So next slide. I work from these 4 words. All of my work, like table legs on a table, these 4 words hold up and support my work: memory, identity, difference, and justice. And again, I don't have any real answers to these questions that I raise or that I try to raise. But one of the things that I've discovered as I've done research and read and studied and watched and listened to people from all disciplines, one of the things that I really impressed me and started to give me some idea about an answer is Ernest Becker's book, and really all of his books, but his one book called The Denial of Death. And he's also written The Birth and Death of Meaning and The Escape from Evil, among others. But The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker, he's written in 1974, I believe. He talks about this idea of our impending death, the knowledge that we're going to die. So we're the only living creatures that have this knowledge. And that does really weird things to our head. It gets in our minds, and we act out in really strange ways, unconsciously, subconsciously, do things and treat people in ways that challenge that death anxiety. We come up with what he calls immortality projects to stave off that knowledge, that impending death. If we were Sheldon Solomon, his protege, he wrote a book called The Worm at the Core, and he talks about the terror management. And Ernest Becker talks about if we were to have full knowledge and really concentrate and have our days just consumed with this impending death that we're all facing, would be curled up in a ball in the corner of the room constantly. So what we do is we come up with immortality projects, just like this one I'm showing you right now. This is a way for me to live on. This is a way, my books, my photography, my writing, this is a way for me to live on. This is one of the things I deal with to deal with my death anxiety. And once that's challenged by someone or something, people tend to lash out. And so when religion is a good area for this. So if you look back through history, most of the wars that were fought and most of the crimes that were committed or terrible things that have happened, injustices that have happened, usually the center of those conflicts are religious conflicts or there's some core to that. And what religious belief is a big immortality project. It staves off that death anxiety. And so when people challenge your belief systems, challenge your religion, your way of life, your views, you tend to lash out at them. And there's a lot of examples in The Denial of Death that Ernest Becker talks about that really answered a lot of my questions about how we've marginalized certain groups of people and why we've lashed out at them and used them as scapegoats. And so if you're ever interested in knowing why we do the things we do, The Denial of Death is a great book to read. It'll give you some insight to that. So that's probably the only and closest thing I can give you to an answer for all this. But so those are the 4 words. So the next slide we'll go on to and look at this Portraits of Madison Avenue here. But first, I want to give you a little background on my DNA. During my graduate degree, I had my DNA tested through the National Geographic Genome Project. My Y-DNA is J2, and my mitochondrial DNA, my mother's DNA, is U3. I'm 95% plus European, mostly Jewish on that side, and about 5% Native American. So I have genocide on both sides of my genetic background, and this kind of drives these ideas and these questions. And I've always wondered, I didn't know this until 2005, so until I got the science back on it, I just really didn't know. But it's an interesting concept because in my thesis, my graduate degree thesis, I wrote a whole chapter on genetic memory. And I wrote that in 2006 and 2007. And I said, I bet you anything that in the future they'll find out that the telomeres on the DNA, little components of our DNA, retain memories of our ancestors and in fact convey and transmit genetic trauma to offspring. And in fact, they just, in the last couple of years, they have said that's actually true. So it's an interesting thing, not saying that you inherit PTSD or genetically inherit, nightmares and frightening things, but I'm not saying that's impossible either. So you do carry a lot of your tribe and your memories and your likes and dislikes from your genetics play a big role in that. So this is my mother and father. My father up in the top left there photographing collodion, and my mother before she died in the bottom right there photographing collodion, and then a photograph of them in 1959, right as they were married. So that's the whole kit and caboodle, if you will, on the context and who I am and my background. So let's go ahead and take a look at this portrait to Madison Avenue, if you will. Next slide. This is a body of work that I made over these 6 years, partly in graduate school, partly not, all in wet collodion. These are all black, mostly black glass ambrotypes. Direct positive images on a large format camera on black glass, and they're called black glass ambrotypes. So next slide. This is about my questions living my father owned some low income apartment complexes. They were on a street called Madison Avenue. It's not the Madison Avenue people think about, but I use that as kind of a draw. And 8, 10 years old, I'd go to him in these apartment complexes. There were heroin addicts and convicts and amputees and all the kind of throwaway people at the margins of society. And I was just fascinated, and I was in a world of my own and wondering how and why they lived so differently, why people treated them so differently. So these questions started long, long ago for me. If you want to, you can read that statement on my website, but we'll go to the next slide. So I just want to pack through these real quick. Technically, this is a whole plate image, a 6.5 by 8.5. This happens to be a clear glass ambrotype. This was made with a north light, natural sunlight. Collodion has a unique way of seeing colors. His eyes are blue, so they rendered his eyes very bright and almost illuminated. And you can see the hammerheads are illuminated as well. They were a silver color. So it's got some real unique abilities. It was made with a Petzval lens, an old de Rogy lens, a very fast lens. So it's really soft and swirly, and there's only one sharp area. So as we look through these, you can kind of pick that up. So next slide. Heroin addict. This is quarter plate black glass, a small plate. I used to put my fingerprints and have the sitters put their fingerprints on the glass as well. Next slide. The Patriot. This was March 19, 2003. That was the beginning of the war. And kind of commenting different. This happens to be a 5 by 17 type. A little mixed up different mediums. They're all direct positive stuff. Next slide. This is interesting because this was before I went to Europe or started doing any work on the Holocaust, the next project. And this triptych, this is the way the Nazis photographed Jewish folks and other people, other undesirables in Germany. The full profile with a head brace, the 3/4 with a bolo or a hat, and then a direct on. And I didn't learn that until after I'd done some of these. This young man, this was his work shirt. The only thing I did is I covered his name tag up with tape, just kind of take his identity away. And you'll see here I'm objectifying these people. I'm taking their names away. I'm making them things. I'm objectifying them on purpose, trying to convey a point about all this. So next slide. Criminal number 2. Next slide. This is Sam Kirby, the guy before. If you go to my website, you can watch a video of him talking about how people treat him like he's a monster and he wants to commit suicide. And he wanted to come up with this whole thing. So one weekend, I photographed a lot of these guys in my studio for over a year. Some of them made many, many different plates of them, and he wanted to act some of this stuff out. So we did some of this stuff, and it was actually kind of cathartic for maybe both of us. Next slide. Same thing. I actually used this one as the murder of Stephen Lux, 1936. I renamed it and put it in my Holocaust work because I just found it very powerful. Next slide. This is Miriam, an amputee. She told me, you can watch a video of her on my website as well. She told me that she'll roll into a restaurant or whatever, and anywhere she goes, they don't even see her as a person. They only see her chair. So I thought it'd be interesting to just photograph her chair. So next slide. I photographed just her chair, and that's kind of what they see. Next slide, please. A young man, or well, not a young man now, but a man that I grew up with. Grew up probably 4 or 5, kindergarten together all the way through junior high or high school. I had a twin brother that was the exact opposite of him. Michael and Matthew were their names. Barry, they used to call him Barry the Fairy. And he contacted me some 30 years later about the project I was doing. A friend of mine knew him and said, hey, you should get a hold of this guy. And Michael said, hey, I grew up with him. So we met up and had a great conversation. I ended up making several plates of him and putting him in the show. Next slide. Convict on the run, I had a chance to photograph. Next slide. Working Stiff 2. He's a guy that I found trying on a weekend. It was a Sunday, I remember. He was working on a home next to my studio. I was out there. I don't know what I was doing. I saw him. I thought he was interesting looking. I got talking with him, and he said he was in desperate need of $300 to pay his rent. And he was trying to earn some money. And I said, can I photograph you? And I had him come over to the studio. And he was doing stucco work on a house and with this wide old lens on. And I'm kind of a frustrated painter, so lit him up and made a photograph of him like this. He's hawk and trial. Next slide, please. And then, the whole, controversy around these kinds of things. Religion and politics are my 2 favorite topics to talk about because nobody ever talks about them. So next slide, please. When I got to Germany, I did this, worked with this project. It ended up being called Glass Memories. It was shown with that project you just saw. Struggling to come to terms with the past. If anybody speaks German, I'm sure in Maryland you do. Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Big German compound word, struggling to come to terms with the past. So next slide. I started out making photographs of synagogue sites that were destroyed during Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th, 1938. And then it turned into me photographing what I called the new Jewish people in Germany, the Turks and the Romanians and the Greeks and people that had come there to rebuild the country. This back image. It happens to be a Polish man on the right and a German man on the left there. You can read that statement on my site if you want, but the idea here is nie wieder, never again. The next slide, please. One of the reasons I talk about my DNA is because I did a triptych of myself with my DNA. I wrote it backwards on a piece of paper, put it on a piece of cardboard. This is a self-portrait called Jewish DNA. I lived in a little village called Schierenheim. And did a triptych of 10 types, and I think the other 2 are gone. I think I still have this one now. But this is my Y DNA, my Jewish DNA, written out backwards because it's photographed direct positive, so it would come out backwards if I didn't write it backwards. And then I made a little illusion here to I look really creepy and a little bit scary, and I put it on cardboard like somebody begging on the street kind of thing. So there's a bunch of metaphor going there. So next slide, please. Broken homosexual. This is a black gay man in Germany. You'll see why I call it broken homosexual. This plate, it's fascinating for me to have the opportunity. Again, frustrated painter. I love this very shallow depth of field, very painterly quality. Only his eyes are tack sharp, and the rest are just kind of blown out. And I took it to Paris to show a good calotypist friend, Martin Becca, world's probably the world's best calotypist. And I was getting it out of the back seat in the hotel parking lot. And if you go to the next slide here, you'll see that it had ended up on the ground broken. And I was just completely frustrated. You know, you only get one of these, and yes, you can copy them and all that, but they're not the same. So I lived with it for a few days in the hotel room, and I decided to have my wife and daughter picked up all the pieces and brought it back to Germany. And I ended up putting it back together, and it ended up in the Glass Memory Show. And a guy named Pierre Baron, the guy that did Joe Peter Whitkin's first book, ended up, I did his portrait, and he ended up buying that glass plate, and called it Broken Homosexual. And it added so much depth and so much value to that piece that you never know, you know, some of these happy accidents, serendipity, I guess. It was really a powerful thing to have that physically happen to the plate and then end up like that. So next slide, please. Arbeiter, or a worker, a German worker. I photographed a lot of, I have a fascination with the working class. I come from a blue collar home, a blue, you know, hardworking father and mother, and you know, no silver spoon, and hardworking. And I love to photograph any working class of people, and I found the Germans fascinating. They're it's an amazing culture to live in. This happens to be a tintype or a lumitite whole plate. You know. Next slide. Deutsch Putz, German cleaning lady, Fahrenheit there in my little village. Again, you can see what I'm doing visually. Next slide, please. This is the Nazis marched here to destroy the synagogue in Heidelberg. I lived about 15 minutes from Heidelberg, Germany, and they marched down this road to the synagogue. You'll see in the next frame or the next slide the synagogue. That's the head of the synagogue there, the Torah Ark. I photographed these on whole plate, but I used the lens that was only 220 millimeters, and so it didn't cover the plate. So you get this keyhole effect, this vignetting. And I wanted to give a feeling like you're looking through a keyhole, like you're looking at something you shouldn't be looking at. I wanted to kind of give that feeling to it. And that synagogue stood there for, I don't know, hundreds of years, and they destroyed it. And they rounded up the Jewish folks out of there and took them mostly to Dachau and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Next slide, please. Here's the synagogue in Mainz. I was photographing they call it Denkmal, or a memory stone, and this is where I had a kind of an awakening. There's two pillars there of the synagogue still left, and here I am doing this project that started on Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and I'm pouring this collodion on these glass plates, and it's about the crystal, it's about the glass, and I'm using a fix. My fixer is potassium cyanide, Zyklon B, the very chemical or compound they used in the gas chambers. So I started, the more I worked in the process, the material started revealing all these wonderful things about these connections and how it transcended even what I was doing in a lot of ways that I could talk about and tell stories in new ways through the material. So, and I know you probably can't see it because the quality's low, but right on that Denkmal, one of the reasons I photographed that is somebody came by and just put a big hack on it. You know, there's still a lot of hatred. You know, we know that it's still going on. It's still a big problem. So, next slide. This is Seligenstadt. Seligenstadt. Stadt is a city or a town. Seligen means holy. Seligen is holy city. And this is the only thing that remains of the synagogue they destroyed in Seligenstadt, or holy city. And this ended up being going to New Jersey. The grandson of the rabbi of the synagogue contacted me, and when he saw this, and I couldn't believe it, I was happy to give him that plate. And so his grandfather walked these stairs many, many times, but obviously didn't survive. Next slide. I actually worked on a concentration camp in Sandhofen. It was a small concentration camp, but there were still barracks, little remains of barracks there. And this was the most dramatic photo I could find: the concertina wire and the smokestacks, and it was just looking right off the compound there. Next slide. Judas Baum near my house, Judas tree. We all know the story about Judas and those kinds of things, the Judas Baum. Next slide. Again, we're back in Seligenstadt, the holy city. They not only destroyed the synagogue, but the Friedhof, the cemeteries they go through, and they destroyed all the Jewish headstones and took the stones and used them as building blocks. And some of them were kind of put back together. This one was kind of put back together, and I decided to photograph. I actually made a negative of this too, and unfortunately, it was destroyed on the way back over here. So maybe I should put that back together and see if I can do the same thing I did with the other plate. But next slide, please. Sometimes I go up on the river in Frankfurt on the Main and photograph people. There'd be painters out there that invite me up to make photographs of portraits of people, and I made a lot of beautiful portraits up there on the river, and this is one of them. Next slide, please. Nordic man. This is a guy I did a workshop in Gothenburg, Sweden, and this young man, his name is Aaron. Blonde hair, blue eyes, very fair skinned. He lived north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden, and I looked at the town. This is the area where the Nazis or Hitler took his Aryan race demographic from. So I ended up calling this Nordic man, and I thought it was fascinating how the wet clay process translated him. All that sun exposure in the summer, the collodion process kind of looks below into the melanin, and if your melanin is damaged, you'll show not as a pale-skinned white person, but kind of dark like this. It's interesting. Next slide, please. A German prostitute I photographed in my town there. Next slide. A Künstler, or an artist, a German artist, a Künstler. All of these, the metaphor here is all of these people are either representing marginalized or unwanted people in that country, including myself, right? Richard Avedon said all his portraits are in the end self-portraits, and it's so true. But artists were definitely targeted. Intellectuals were targeted. Obviously, Jewish people, Polish, dissidents, all kinds of political people. So there's all kinds of people that were murdered for their beliefs or their positions. Next slide, please. Another black man in Germany. I had, sometimes the light is just beautiful. I did this in my winter garden in the north side of my home in Germany there. I had a covering on, and I set them out, and the light was just beautiful. This is actually a wet clay negative and a print, a contact, an albumin print, gold toned albumin print. Next slide, please. Oma, grandma, she lived a house next door to us there in Germany. She lived in a home that was owned by a Jewish doctor and his daughter that were removed in 1942 and sent to Auschwitz and murdered. And she's an Italian immigrant, and her family, I became good friends with her grandson, and talked her into coming over and sitting in my backyard and photographing her. Next slide. Then we came back to America. I moved back to Denver here in 2011, and with fresh eyes, being away for so many years in Europe, I wanted to photograph my people and look at the kind of the marginalized people in America and Western America, where I'm from. And so I did a project mostly on ultra large format, 16 by 20 inch glass plates. Some of these are whole plates, but mostly they're large glass, black glass, and clear glass plates. So next slide, please. I just talked about after living abroad. This was the prelude to my ghost dance last project you see here. This was the prelude working me into looking at the West, thinking about the history, having left Europe and thinking about that and the history there. And I'm connected to both of them, right? I mean, this is my history. This is my blood. This is my DNA. I'm connected to both of them. So next slide, please. Overweight breast cancer. These were mostly photographed in my studio. These are her fingerprints and her hand marks all over the image. This is a black glass ambrotype. This is a small one, a whole plate. But this is her fingerprints all over it. She was handling the plate before we pulled it. Her hands ended up all over it. Kind of a metaphor for it, right? Next slide, please. Cancer patient. Another small plate. Next slide, please. And here we move into the larger plates, the mammoth plate, 16 by 20 inches. Here is Mr. Gardner. He owns the largest collection of 19th century original musical instruments. He's a fascinating person. I consider him a friend, a great guy. His Bowie knife, that's an original 19th century Bowie knife. I happen to be a knife maker, and I know and understand the history of the Bowie knife or the Bowie knife, however you want to call it, the Arkansas toothpick, whatever you want to call it. And these images started my really pushed me into the Ghost Dance project as I started making these types of images. Next slide, please. Candy, again, just an interesting person here in Denver. Big plate. Next slide, please. Cannabis farmer. Probably everyone knows in the States by now that cannabis is legal here. This is a little bit before it was legal, but there was a big push on it. People were getting ready, and there were a lot of farmers gearing up. And I wanted to make some portraits of them. This is one of them. And I cut the plate up. You see these marks all over the plate. This is distressed on purpose. And if you could actually see the plate, you can see it even better. Next slide, please. Wing walker. She relieved her stress by putting her goggles on in her suit, and she'd walk on the wings of airplanes. So I thought it was pretty fascinating. All kinds of different characters. And just an interesting person, too. Next slide, please. Paleolithic man. I always like to photograph interesting. I don't just like to photograph. I like to photograph anybody that's interesting looking, that can tell a story and evoke emotion. Next slide, please. Good friend of mine, Jody, here in Denver. He's a great guy. He'd tell me stories about how the Chinese restaurants here, he'd call up and place an order and give him his name, Jody, and they'd just giggle and laugh about that. I thought that was always kind of interesting. He's a photographer as well, Navy veteran. He's got some great stories and just an all-around good guy, but definitely in the margins. Next slide, please. Sarah, she lives in Evergreen, Colorado, just up the canyon, heading into the Rockies out of Denver here. I think she said in the 70s on Christmas Eve, I can't remember what year, her and her sister and her mother was in the car on Christmas Eve. It was snowing real bad. The sisters were in the back, Sarah and her sister was in the back seat, and her mother was driving. She went through a green light, and she was T-boned and killed immediately. And these tattoos are representative of her mother's memory and how she remembers her mother. And normally the face is what I'd want to look at in a photograph. This is probably one of the only photographs I've ever made without a face in it. But next slide, please. Kylie lives in Nederland, Colorado, or did, up in the hippie villages of the mountains. And she interned with me for about 6 months in my studio in Denver. I photographed her a lot. Fascinating young woman. Next slide, please. You ever seen that movie Cowboys and Aliens? This is the fiddle player in it, Rex Rideout, from Conifer, Colorado. Very interesting character. Plays music from the 19th century, plays all kinds of instruments, has all kinds of original materials. A very fascinating guy. Next slide, please. And a blind artist, just to cap it all off, just for fun. And one more, I think the next slide, I think that was it. So now, last one, I'll go through this fairly quickly. Ghost Dance, the Native American Massacre site. The evolution going through, looking at my history and what I'm connected with and what I'm interested in is the history of my people, the history of what's happened, the history of how humanity has treated one another, and then trying to, the famous saying, those who forget the history are bound to repeat it. You can see the evolution of my work. So Ghost Dance, Native American Massacre sites. I started out doing the entire western United States and then ended up only doing 2 sites here in Colorado to make it manageable. The Sand Creek Massacre site, about 2 hours from me, and I live just on the plains outside of Denver here on the eastern plains, the Beecher Island, Battle of Beecher Island. Those are the 2 sites I concentrated on. So next slide, please. I just talked about that here. You can read this on my website. I focus a lot on Colonel John Shivington, the guy that led the massacre at Sand Creek, what actually happened there. Congressional and Senate testimony I quote quite a bit, and I go through that kind of stuff. So next slide, please. A lot of the material, the still lifes you're going to see in here, are all of them are either the sites themselves or materials that I have taken from the site. So these are oak galls and a little rabbit skull. This is on the cover of my book. Cheyenne had a great saying about the rabbits, and the oak galls are produced on these large oak trees on the plains. When they have an invader, they cover them with this. They send out a chemical and they cover the invader up into a ball, and the ball falls off the tree, and they get rid of their invader. So everything has something to do with the connection to the genocide, the massacre, invasion, something like that. These are 6 by 6 inch pop prints, meaning they're collodial chloride or collodion aristotype prints from wet collodion negatives. I did a total of 52 negatives, and I show about 22 of them in the work, and I'm currently printing out about 20 of them in oil prints right now. But next slide, please. Again, just bizarre things you see on the plains, on these massacre sites, the railroad tracks, the cross there above this kind of abandoned site. It's just a metaphor for all of this. Next slide, please. Captain Silas Sewell, if you've ever done any study on the Sand Creek Massacre here in Colorado, you'll know he is the only person that refused to commit genocide on the men and women, children of Sand Creek. And the Native Americans, the Cheyenne and Arapaho, run from Sand Creek all the way up to Denver here to the Fairfield Cemetery here where this is in Denver, and they honor him, and well, they should, because he was the only one that didn't fire, and he was assassinated in April of '65 here in Denver, basically because he didn't follow orders, basically. Next slide, please. Fox jaw, bullet holes. I'll talk about the thistle and the cottonwood tree here in a bit. These are all objects of the fox jaw I found on the site. And thistle grows here everywhere, and it's imported from Europe. It's an invasive weed, and the cottonwood tree is what most teepees and a lot of peace pipes and things are made out of. Next slide, please. And here's Big Sandy Creek, Sand Creek area where the natives ran and were slaughtered. You can read this. A little boy, about 3 years old. This is from testimony from Scott Anthony. They each took their turn trying to shoot him, to hit him. The little naked 3-year-old boy fired at the little child but missed him. The third man came out, made a similar remark, and fired, and the little fellow dropped. So these kinds of things constantly were going on. And it's a very difficult and humbling experience to be in these places, and they're very difficult to photograph because it's not like I have something exciting to photograph. And it was a real challenge, but, I did my best with it. Next slide, please. This is just an example of one of the negatives I put on a whiteboard and copied, and I show the negatives in positive prints, mostly pop prints. I'll show you. Next slide, please. That negative goes to that pop print. This is the Sand Creek site, a keep out sign in the massacre area. The quote there, Shivington and his men dressed their weapons in hats and gear with the scalps and other body parts, including human fetuses and male and female genitalia. So when we talk about massacre sites, we're talking about the most gruesome form of murder and genocide you can imagine. Very similar to the Holocaust, very similar to those, the worst inhuman nature you can ever imagine. So you see the pop print there. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll see that's an oil print. And this is what I'm doing now. I'm doing oil prints of all these negatives. They're more pictorialist. The Rollins oil print is just pigment, a gelatin, and swollen gelatin and ink. I use this kind of dark brown ink, kind of similar warm colors, very pictorialist. It's kind of a movement around the turn of the 20th century in response to this kind of straight photography. And they just tell more of the story for me. It's a blurred, kind of dreamy, weird, dark kind of history. And I love how this kind of transcends. It's not even a photograph, it's a print. There's no silver in it. There's just gelatin and ink. And I'm working on a series of those right now. Next slide, please. There's the rabbit head and the galls again, just a little different shot. That's a rabbit skull I found on site. Next, and this is where I talk about, this is I ran into some very bizarre scenes as I went through these massacre sites and found them on the maps and went through general locations. Abandoned military equipment next to these, what I call dirt teepees. I thought it was just a bizarre scene. It was just like a foreign object and these this kind of weird setup and weird scene. And I call it ghost dancing. Ghost dance was a ritual dance that was believed to drive away white people and restore the traditional lands and way of life for the American Indian. Next slide. The tree people, this is the actual land that they were murdered on in Stein Creek. I just quote, some things out of the documents, the Senate and congressional testimony talking about body parts of the slaughtered to be taken back to Denver for display in the Apollo Theater and for a 1 mile long parade down Larimer Street. So this wasn't just a genocide. This was mutilation and celebration. The people weren't even seen as human beings. They weren't even seen as animals. They were seen as something that it's unimaginable. I have a hard time even dealing with it. Next slide, please. No trespassing, same thing, just a different site. Some bones and sticks in the foreground. Next slide. The thistle, I talked about the invasiveness and the opiate. This is an 1870s opiate bottle I found out from the inscription on it. And I put these thistles from Sand Creek in it. But the quote is fascinating because I was influenced. Drex Brooks was one of my undergraduate professors in photography. And in his book, Sweet Medicine, and I recommend you get that book if you're interested in this at all, he was the one that inspired me 25 or 30 years ago to do a project like this. But the quote is wonderful. He's talking about Drex's book, she's talking about Drex's book, Limerick is, we live, these photographs tell us, in a state of blunted feeling, capable of a cheerful indifference when we visit land once steeped in human agony. Contemplating this indifference can be, at first, infuriating. Americans ought to know what acts of violence brought them their right to own land, build homes, use resources, and travel freely in North America. And that's probably the most succinct and powerful commentary you can say about this. And there's nothing we can do about this. All we can do is try to prevent it from ever happening again. And there's a lot of signs that we're not doing such a great job of that even today. So next slide, please. Another thistle shot from the Sand Creek Massacre site. I bring back vegetation. I brought back 3 dead sunflowers from the Sand Creek site, and I cut them up, chopped them up, and put them in a can and put them in my barbecue and turned it to carbon 6 or charcoal. And that carbon 6 I put in guap or carbon tissue making material, and then I made carbon prints from that negative of that material. So I was putting the land in the images. And we kind of talked about this in the beginning, I kind of love to transcend photography that way and look at things a little bit different. So next slide, please. The railroad tracks in the Eastern Plains here, where they just hung out the railroad windows and shot the buffalo by the thousands, killed the bison buffalo by the thousands. And they did that not for sport necessarily, but when you take the buffalo or the bison away from the Indians and Native Americans here, you take their life away. You take their food, their shelter, their clothing. So it was done on purpose. And they damn near drove the buffalo to extinction. So they came very close, just like the people. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to end up with this. These are some of the media presence that I have, and we talked a little bit about my publications, my website, and we'll take some questions. But one more slide. I've got to thank my wife. Go to that last slide. I just want to say my wife Jeannie and my daughter Summer. They worked with me for the last 2 decades on this kind of stuff since Summer was a little girl, and I just wouldn't be able to do anything. And everybody out there that supported me over the years with buying my books, attending my workshops, buying prints and plates, 1,000 thank yous to them. So I appreciate that. That's it for my presentation. I know it was long, but I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has anything.
Oh, we've got a great one from Mary Lou. Mary Lou's first, I'm getting told to turn up my volume. Mary Lou's first question is, she has a question on describing oil prints.
Absolutely. That's great. Hello, Mary Lou. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I can't see you or anything, but I know John's going to relate these to me. Oil prints are wonderful. What they are basically is gelatin. I use an 8% solution of gelatin. I pour it on a plate with some magnetic strips to hold it in the size of the format that I want to work with. I pour it in a little container, about a millimeter thick, about 25, 30 mils on a size of negative I do, a 6x6 negative. And I let that dry. That gelatin will dry. And I take that paper, I pin it down, and I use dichromate. And I brush dichromate on that gelatin. And dichromate will sensitize, make it sensitive to light. Once that's dry, I can lay my negative on it and do a contact print of that. I print that on to the gelatin. The gelatin that receives the light hardens, completely hardens. The complete void area is your negative. The clear area is your negative. Hardens. And the highlights, or where you're blocking the light from the gelatin, will remain soft, will not harden. So that way, when you swell the gelatin, the highlights puff up and fill with water, and the shadows stay hard and do not swell up. And when you run ink, you take lithographic ink and you roll it over, you pound it on with the brush, or you brush it on. The highlights will repel that ink, and the shadow areas will take the ink. So you end up with I show this one often.
Oh, we have lost, everybody hold on a second. We have lost Quinn. I'm going to need to get him back. Quinn, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, yeah. For some reason we lost you, so I'm glad we have you back. We are now back.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. But so those are oil prints, gelatin, and ink. That's basically what it is. It's a pretty straightforward process. It's not that difficult to do once you've done it a few times. You can get the process down quite well. And again, it's not a photograph. Silver gelatin or silver doesn't contain any silver nitrate or silver. It's just gelatin and ink. So we call them prints or pigment prints. And super archival, just wonderful. And I think they're beautiful. They're very poetic, and they fit my aesthetic. And a lot of times I talk about matching your semiotics with your semantics, right? Your words with your images, and what you're trying to accomplish through both of those. So, oil prints, you should try them.
Real quick on that, Quinn. I think when we lost you, I think we missed a little bit of the information on what the dichromate does to the gelatin and how the ink adheres or doesn't adhere. Can you just go over that real quick?
Absolutely. So what you have is a gelatinized piece of paper with that 8% gelatin on it that's dried. You cover it with a 5% solution of dichromate, potassium or ammonium, it doesn't matter. Ammonium's a little faster, quicker exposure. But potassium dichromate, for example, you let that dry, you put your negative on it, and the highlights that block the light, the gelatin underneath will not harden. It will stay soft when you put it in water. The light that goes through the negatives, or where your shadow areas are, your clear glass or your clear plastic, will harden that gelatin. The light will hit the gelatin, dichromated gelatin, and that gelatin will harden. Meaning that when you put it in water to swell the gelatin, it will not swell. It'll stay flat. And then you swell the gelatin, you put it on your board to ink it. When you roll your ink over it or you pounce your ink on it, the highlights that are swollen will reject the ink, and the flat areas will accept the ink. So your shadow areas go dark, your midtones go, your midtones to your dark areas take on ink, and your highlights repel ink. You think of it as oil and water, so to speak, is the analogy they use. And it's like I said, it's a beautiful process, and I think everybody should give it a try. It's inexpensive, and really, you do it a couple of times, it's quite easy to do. It's kind of time consuming, but it's worth it.
Make sure everyone make sure you follow Quinn on Facebook, follow Quinn on YouTube. Quinn, what's your YouTube channel?
It's just Quinn Jacobson. You go search Quinn Jacobson or Studio Q. You'll find me. I try to post up there quite often, and I'm on Instagram at Historic Process, and Facebook. You can find me everywhere. Just Google my name. You'll find me.
But definitely go check Quinn out on those services. I know on Facebook he's been doing he's been just giving this knowledge to the world, how he does his oil prints. And if you go to his Facebook page, are you also putting them on YouTube, Quinn?
I do. I try to upload them the next day once I get them downloaded. If my Zoom room records, I put them up on YouTube the next day. Yes. And we just finished that one today on inking the print, and I'm going to do one on Saturday, a show about making oil prints on glass. I'm going to put oil on glass, dichromate it, expose it, roll it with ink. It'll be on a piece of glass rather than paper. It might be interesting.
Definitely follow Quinn. Check these out. Even if you're not ever going to do these processes, just some of the inspirational just thoughts that come out of Quinn's head when he's smacking a piece of paper with a brush full of lithographic ink is just amazing. And you'll get to see the process as well. He's very good at education and letting everybody know what is happening. I do have a question from Janet, but I'm going to go to one more question just because I think it catches on with the last question. Mary Lou asks also, do you work with color?
Do I work with what?
Color.
You mean in the oil print?
I believe she means with the oil prints, but let's say, do you work with color? And let's take that to maybe any kind of pigmenting on tintypes.
I have done the two things in color that I have done. On the oil print side, I have various ink colors, lithographic ink colors that I've been experimenting with for quite a while now. Actually, they're not radically different: reds, yellows, browns, black, those kinds of things. On the tintype side, you can burnish silver and you can take pastel chalks and color, and I've done that with tintypes. Just experimental. I've never found any use for it personally because I've never done really like that 19th century aesthetic. You look at the American Civil War and things where they do the portraits and they put the little rosy cheeks on and maybe color the attire, the dress, and things like that. I find that fascinating. If you were after that aesthetic, you could surely do that. And I've seen people do watercolors, all kinds of different things. But I haven't experimented much with color, simply other than the color of one of those words that I use, memory. I use the color of a memory, the older color, the warm colors, the antique colors, just to give that idea of something that's in the past. And I want to convey that visually. So that's about the color, the extent of the color I use. I have experimented though with using color on tintypes, and with oil printing, you can mess around with color as well.
We have a listener, Janet. Janet writes some very powerful photographs. She loves them. Do you ever do pictures that aren't? Do you ever do any pictures that aren't as deep, and do regular color prints? She's talking about. She also asks, which photograph from tonight's show is your favorite?
Wow, that's a great question. I have to admit something. It's interesting that she asked that because I'm a veteran of the military, the Army. Like you saw on my CV there. One of the things they offered me was to move to Germany and do portraits of the soldiers going to Afghanistan and Iraq and coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. So I had a color portrait studio. That's all I did was I shot color portraits of soldiers. I made their deployment photographs and their returning photographs, and I document those and print those. And that had nothing to do with my personal work, right? But that's what I did. And I really don't do much color portraiture photography. This is basically most of the time when I pour a plate or I load a camera up with image making material, it's basically in service of an idea about some of my projects or some of my questions. My boy, that's the second part of that question. My favorite photograph is that's a very difficult question to answer. It's probably this one right here. If you see behind me here, I don't know if you this one right here.
Yes,
this 4x5 negative that I made of this young man. Primarily just the technical ability of it. Very partly lucky and partly the light was just beautiful and the process just rendered it so beautifully. But I have to admit, the broken homosexual plate is a very conceptually powerful piece for me. So I would say probably some of those. It's very difficult for me to. They're all, like Avedon said, I said earlier, Richard Avedon, the famous portrait photographer, he said, all my portraits are self-portraits in the end. And I feel the same way. It's hard for me to choose a favorite. They're all kind of in service of this larger question. And so I like them all, obviously. I've edited them down from hundreds or thousands of plates. So it's a good question, though.
Quinn, speaking of concepts, does the feeling or does the theme of your image, does that dictate how you may mount it, how you may present it?
Yeah, that's interesting because the last show I had at the last exhibition I had of those large plates in Paris of the American West portrait. I had them just put railing up, and I slid the big plates in just raw, no glass, nothing framed. You saw the whole thing, just the real authentic kind of feeling, right down to kind of the more refined matted glass framed pieces. I like to be as real and raw as possible. I like to show, especially in this work, to be as authentic as I possibly can be. So if I could, I'd show everything just as it comes out, without any ornate, any distractions, any covering, anything like that. But to your question, I do believe that's a very important factor.
Before we move on, do you own a digital camera?
I do own a digital camera. I do. And you know what I use it for?
What's that?
I use it to copy my plate.
Good. Hey, that's good enough. Oh, when you're out and about, I mean, do you use it as a kind of a snapshot thing, like you're just?
You know what? I sometimes use my phone to do that. I actually do, and I love digital for that reason. I don't use it in my personal work. It's not the right aesthetic. It's not the right kind of thing for me. But I think digital is great. And the things they're coming up with now, the technology is mind-boggling. So yeah, I do. I'll take snapshots of scenes. I'll visit places, certain types of light, certain types of year, certain times of day, those kinds of things. It's a great reference tool. I mean, it's just a wonderful tool that way for me.
Christine asks, do you have a favorite theme or medium that you like to use, and does it change with every story that you tell?
That's another really good question. If you look at those four bodies of work that I just put up there, or John just clicked through, you'll see the theme and the underlying current is all basically the same. It's basically, say the last project, the Ghost Dance, has no people, no people portraits in it. I consider landscape and still life portraits in a way, but those first three projects are all marginalized communities. And if you read my statements, I would answer the question like this. The theme, I'm using an abandoned process to photograph abandoned people. I'm using a process that shows our own human imperfections on the plate, on the images, and echoes that imperfection in humanity. And I'm trying to display all that. So that theme would be the authentic, raw, real human being. We live in this culture and this society that, I say teaspoon deep, and we're worried about money and how we look, and is that right? And am I driving the right car? And do I live in the right place? Do I have the right stuff? Am I thin enough? Am I, whatever it is. It's always something that we're trying to live up to. And the theme that I try to get across is this real, authentic, raw humanity that I really connect to. I find believe it or not, I find really beautiful portraits in my work. And not because I make them, but the people are beautiful. The people look real to me. They look authentic. And that theme for me can only be accomplished through these types of processes, through these arduous, kind of difficult, dangerous processes to kind of bring all that through. And I always talk about the sitter co-creating the image with me. So it's not just me with a strobe kit and a camera, digital or film or whatever, just snapping frames. This is one plate that takes several minutes to prepare, get the light right, put them in a head brace, and they have to hold still and cooperate. And they're involved in the image like no other. And I think there's something special about that. So this process gives you the ability to interact with other human beings in a way no other photographic process will allow you. So the theme for me is real and raw and authentic and nothing to hide. And I love that about this process.
Gotcha. Now, of course, this process has so many different ends for putting a personal touch on it. What would you say to someone that we're always trying to get them into something like this, but what are you going to say to the people that are kind of just using a digital camera and putting it on a piece of digital paper, printer paper? What would you say for them to look at, or maybe some inspiration for them to put this kind of a story into their work?
Yeah, that's another good line of conversation. I would say, and again, I want to emphasize the medium will only come into play when you have the narrative or the idea fleshed out or worked out. In other words, when you have people say, how did you pick these subjects? How do you pick these topics? How do you choose it? And a lot of times I'll answer, I don't really choose it. What I've done is I've gone inside my heart and my head and I've examined, the old Socratic philosophy, an unexamined life kind of thing. I've examined what really burdens me, what I feel strongly about. And I started taking that step by step and figuring out what it is that I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to share, what I'm really concerned with. And that's really what drove me to these processes, was the aesthetic of these processes, the ritual and the ceremonies of these processes gave me the ability to tell the story better, to show the story better, to be, like I said, authentic and real about it. And so what I try to inspire people to do is maybe put the camera down for a minute. Maybe put the ideas of making photographs down just for a minute. Take a little moratorium on that. And maybe examine what really matters to you, what you're really concerned about. And then start stepping into it visually and start thinking about ideas, how I can photograph this concept, the way I feel about it and the way that I'm concerned with it, that gives me the ability to communicate that to another person. And even if that person doesn't like your photographs, or even if they don't like the concept, it doesn't matter, because most people will never know who I am or that I ever made a photograph. And to be honest with you, nobody really cares if I ever make another photograph, to be honest with you, but I do. And that's what's most important to me, is that I have to unburden myself with these ideas or with these concerns that I have. And you saw in my statement there, start with something that you're concerned with, a social problem, a political problem, a personal problem. Start with something that may be difficult to tackle or deal with, and write about it and think about it, and then bring your camera to it. And if the digital camera and the Epson print doesn't give you the aesthetic that matches that narrative or that story, look at another process. Look at maybe another medium. Maybe you sculpt, maybe you paint, maybe you play music, maybe you do something in a different medium. I try to inspire people. You're going to make powerful images or powerful art with good stories you're connected to, that you have skin in the game with, so to speak, that you are really concerned with, and that you are really have questions or concerns, or you love something, or you dislike something, or whatever it is. You need to be driven. You need to be passionate about what you're talking about and have a concern. I think that's the biggest problem right now is the old saying, when I was a kid growing up, in the 70s, I saw that phrase that the problem with America is apathy, but who cares? I think there's apathy going on. I think everything's just kind of given to us. Photographically, it's kind of just handed to us. We don't work for anything. There's kind of a lack of value in a lot of things. So that makes us let our guard down. We stop thinking about things so much, and we could get into a little problematic areas where we just start emulating or copying styles or looks and feels without any desire to be connected to it. Why did you make that photograph? Because they made it and it looks cool and I like it and it looks cool, and the conversation stops. I mean, that's okay if you want to do that, but if you really want to engage people, if you can share something, why I made this photograph is because I have these questions about this, and this. What do you think about it? What do you feel about that topic? That, like I said, art should be a catalyst or a vehicle to start a discussion about things that really matter. And it's powerful. I mean, art, you imagine the world without art would really be in a world of hurt.
It's very interesting, Quinn, that you mentioned people to put the digital camera down and think and feel and look. Let's say two people drive up to the same site, you and a digital photographer. The digital photographer is going to get out, click the button, and be done. How long is it going to take you to get out of your car, set up your wet plate, everything, get the plate done, and get back in? I don't think people are going to understand the amount of time that's going to take.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I might even pull up to the place and look at the light, and it might be the wrong time of day or the wrong time of year, and I might have to come back at another time to even do this. But when that light and timing is right, I'd get out of the vehicle. I have a mobile darkroom in the back of my truck that I slide to the tailgate. I set up my darkroom. I pull my 10 by 10 camera out. I set my camera up, put my lens on. I get my plate ready. I get my chemistry out of the cooler. I fill up my silver bath tank. I do all the stuff in the darkroom, get my developer ready. I make a test plate. I pour a plate. It takes me about 5-10 minutes to make the test plate. I look at the exposure on the test plate and I judge and value, am I making a positive? Am I making a negative? Am I making both? And what I need to do there, I have to have all my material prepped and cleaned before I even get to the site. So all my glass has to be cut, deburred, and cleaned. All my metal or tin types have to be cut and prepared. And so by the time I pull away from there with 2 images, I might be 2 hours, something like that, an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Wow.
But those two images will be images that I want, that won't just be another in a long list in a Lightroom download or Lightroom drop or a Photoshop drop or something. Those 2 images will be images that I'll work with. I'll print them out on different papers and different types of prints, silver chloride prints, pigment prints. I'll test what works best for what I'm trying to say with that image or images. And so it's a long process, and it's a value process. It's a process that I can explain to people, galleries. I've sold a lot of my work in galleries. I've sold a lot of my plates in galleries, and people, especially in Europe, understand the value, and they will pay for that value. They know what you have in it, not just your experience and time learning all of it, but the actual making of a plate or a print. They understand that value. So it's monetary things you're after. I say these processes are much more valuable because you have many more resources involved. I'm not so concerned with the monetary resources as I am with communicating the ideas, and communicating the ideas have to be done in a certain way visually to communicate those things in my mind. It may not work for everyone, but in my mind, the light has to be right. The plate has to be exposed properly. The image has to look proper for it to work. So, yeah, getting out and snapping a shutter, writing to a CF card, 1 or 10 images or 100 or 1,000 images, versus getting out and pouring plates and sensitizing them and processing them on site and washing them, packing all your gear back up and driving away. You're talking a couple of hours, yeah.
Wow. We have a question. I'm not exactly sure I understand the question, but I believe they're asking how your military photography background changed your before and after photography development. I believe that's the question getting asked.
I think as the person asking it, I see if this is resonates. I think I know exactly what they're asking. I did 3 years as a combat photographer, and after that, as a veteran, I had opportunities to work in the same areas, and I saw a lot of gruesome, disturbing stuff that I had to photograph, and what they call after-action reviews. I didn't attend a lot of those. I didn't go to any post-psychologist kind of, venting and all those things. I used photography. And what the pre-military and the post-military time did for me is really hone me in on the value of life, the meaning of existence, and the meaning in life, and what gives you value or meaning in your life, and how people correlate and relate to one another, and how they treat one another. And so, we talk about war, we talk about genocide, we talk about the enemy, all of these things. The military really brought out in me the questioning of how we approach that, and the denial of death and our death anxiety and all those things that come into play that I talked about earlier. Those conceptual or philosophical questions really came to the forefront. And I used photography as a vehicle post-military to talk about these stories. They are connected to my identity. They are connected to who I am, both genetically and as a human being right now, in living in this culture. But really, the military was the catalyst or the starting jumping off point to start this stuff. Because I didn't do this pre-military. I did this post-military. So I think if that's the question you're asking, that's a very good question. I've been asked that before. I hope that's what you're asking, because it's a very good question. The military did change my views on life, existence, treating the way we treat others, war, the meaning in life, the meaning, giving purpose and meaning in our life, that kind of thing.
It looks like that might not have been the correct answer, but the correct question. But that was heck of an answer, and I'm glad we had those wires crossed. She's more wondering if you ever did a show of pictures of the men and women before and after deployment, kind of like a project like that.
Fascinating. Yes. I was thinking about doing that while I was there, and giving a throwback to the old Civil War stuff, right? The American Civil War,
mm-hmm.
The 19th century stuff, using this process. I thought about photographing the pre-deployment and post-deployment military, because I did a lot of them. I did hundreds of them for sure, okay? Over those 5 years, I did hundreds of them. But there was a lady in, I believe, Savannah, Georgia, that started a project doing exactly that with wet collodion. And she actually did the 24th Infantry Division soldiers. And that's the very unit that I served in. I was with the 24th Infantry.
Wow.
And so she started that project. So that kind of put the kibosh on that for me, because I don't like to, get into people's space. I thought about it for a long time, and I'd definitely be justified in doing it. But I just let that go. But that's a great question, and definitely would have been an interesting project to do, just to see that. And I could see it just in the pre and post photographs that I made of them. A lot of these guys, a lot of them had landed in Langstuhl, wounded, and then come, into the studio. We were in Mannheim, Germany, and in my studio, and I photographed them there after they came out of the hospital of Langstuhl. So there were definitely changes in them, both physically and mentally, and you could see it in their faces. A lot of them were really strong people, and they tried to hide all that stuff, but you could see it. And it was a good question, though. Yeah, I would have done that had I had the opportunity, or not stepped on another person's project at the time.
With any with the people with the soldiers that you had photographed that had gotten out of the war zone and out of the hospital. Did you manipulate your photos and the way you took the photos to reflect more of their personal experience?
No, these were all the photographs that I did for the Army. I did them for Army, Navy, Marines, all of them, Air Force. Those are official photographs, the United States Department of Defense. So I couldn't manipulate them. They were straightforward. They were lit like just a straightforward lighting, a hair light, a main light, and a fill light with a gray background and a flag. I couldn't do anything with them. So the only changes I saw were I could pull up the pre and the post and look at them. They wouldn't even see it. I was just curious, I didn't do any of that. These were official photographs for the government. I didn't manipulate them. They were documents, and they were done, basically anonymous. I was just a photographer working for the Department of Defense, and gave me a chance to go to Europe. So that's why I did it. But no, I never did. I had a hard time dealing with even telling anybody about my military and all that stuff. I didn't really want to be associated with that for a very long time, but I came to grips with everything. And after 25 years, I finally went in and I went to the vet service here. A friend of mine that was out of the wars, he said, "Quinn, you need to go over here and get this attorney. They'll represent you." Went to the Veterans Administration. I finally got all my stuff documented. I got my disability stuff done that I didn't do for years. I got all that stuff that I should have done many, many years ago. I never did it. And so I had a hard time I didn't even want to tell anybody about, I didn't even want to mention it. Not because I was damaged so much as just, it wasn't something I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the ideas around it, but I didn't want to talk about me being a victim in the military or something bad happening to me,
Gotcha. We have probably last call for photographs. It's getting a little late. We have two more questions. The next question is going to be, what is a head brace?
A head brace. That is I'm looking at two of them right here in my studio. It's a large metal base. With a stand with a pronged head on it that you put on the back of the head like this to hold the head in place, because everyone tremors, and these exposures are several seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds, sometimes even longer. So if you put a person in a head brace, it gives them something to lean against and concentrate and hold their head still and look into the camera or look into wherever you're having them look, and it just stabilizes the head. So you don't have that movement unless you want that movement. So a head brace stabilizes the head. And if you're working in wet collodion and you want to do portraits, you almost have to have it.
And the people that use head braces love this question. Oh, you mean that thing to hold dead people up in Civil War photos, right?
Yeah. I know. And I've used it. You saw in fact, the title, the head slide. I've used that a lot. I did a whole series of triptychs with the profile with a head brace. It's a gruesome looking thing. People always ask about it. Again, to engage people into your work and have you talk about it, it's great. I don't mean to use it as a gimmick. It's not. It's a utilitarian thing, but it sure engages people and gets people involved and pulls them into your work sometimes.
Fantastic. I have a quick question for you. The ghost dance photos, I saw a lot of just flat, barren land. How do you take flat and I mean, that seems like such a terrible ingredient to start with.
Yes, it is. How do you make that work? That's a wonderful question, and I wrestle with that all the time. The way I answer that question, it's not the first time I've been asked that. The way I answer that question is when you go to these sites and there is absolutely nothing there. The Tree People is a great example of that. And nothing there except two old dead trees, and one looks like they're holding a gun and standing up, and it's just bizarre. And you want to photograph that land, and there's nothing there. There's something about standing in a place where these tragic things happen, just like the quote from Limerick I read. All these things start flooding into your head. You're standing on ground where blood flowed, where bodies decayed, where people were mutilated. And the land takes on a different presence. And when you photograph that and you bring back a plate that's just barren land with a tree trunk sticking up, it's hard to communicate that to people to make that a powerful photograph or to make it interesting. So two things I say. You include the context with it, meaning you include text with it. And in these cases, I included congressional and Senate testimony about the massacre that happened on that piece of land. And you also surround it with other work to give it even more context, to show the larger picture rather. And so basically, to answer the question is you surround it and you support it with the concept and the idea of the larger story. Because you can't take that barren, flat, empty land and present that as some wonderful thing that, there it is. Oh, look at that beautiful photograph. I want to hang that in my living room. You don't want to do that. You can't do that. There's nothing visually spectacular about it. So you tell the story, and then the story transforms that image into something different. That open, barren land with those sticks sticking up now becomes this graveyard of massacre and mutilation. And you have the story, and you understand it, and you put it into context. That changes everything about it. And that's basically how I answer that question.
So it's basically less caring. I mean, you do want something that people are going to want to own themselves, but I guess it sounds like you really want to do those people justice in creating something as visually interesting that's just not going to be thrown away because it may be powerful, but it's boring as hell to look at.
Exactly, and I even write about it in the book. In my statement, I talk about what am I going to do? I travel to these places and they're just barren, open land. There's just nothing there. There's a ravine or there's this or there's that. And one of the reasons I started, and I was very fortunate doing this, one of the reasons I started taking objects and plants and skulls and bones and things from these sites is I was able to surround those lands where this actually physically took place that are not aesthetically powerful or just amazing to look at, and surround it with more interesting content, and then infuse it with the semantics, with the words, and give it the context, and bring it to life that way, because it is what it is. I can't go out there and stage things, or I can't photograph beautiful rock canyons, and there's so much beauty here landscape-wise in Colorado. I can't just go photograph that and say there's a landscape there, right, or a massacre site there, right? I can't do that. Mm-hmm. So I have to deal with what I'm given. The big key truth in my work is that I want these events to be remembered. That's important to me. So that's what I have to work with. Sand Creek and Beecher Island. That's what I have to work with. The little T, my truth is that I'm able to surround that and be a little creative with objects and things from the sites that might make it a little more interesting. But the big takeaway, I don't want people to hang this work above their couch. I don't want people to have this in a beauty book. I want this to be in people's minds. I want them to remember that human beings can act out in very terrible ways and do terrible things if we don't keep these memories alive. And that's all I'm trying to do. And if my artwork's successful on any level, I want it to be successful that I threw a little stone in your shoe. I made you think about something. I remember seeing some guy had these images about a massacre site and, or a Holocaust thing, or, I want you to remember how terrible humanity can be, still being hopeful and confident, but never forgetting the past so we don't repeat the stuff. I mean, that's the big object here. It's not to put pretty pictures above your couch or in your office or for posters. That's not my objective.
Okay. One more question, and then we'll get to the question I've been saving until last. Can you talk a little bit about, now, of course, in a lot of these, the earlier images, we saw extremely, extremely shallow depth of field, which everyone here should know that makes very short shutter times, even for a long process like this. What are you thinking for those short shutter speeds? How many seconds is that versus some of your landscape shots where you may have stopped down? What's kind of your range of times for your wet plates?
So technically, a lot of the portrait work that you saw in the first three bodies of work was made with a f2.8 to f4 aperture lens. Old vintage lenses. I use lenses from the 1850s and 1860s. Big pieces of glass, pencil lenses, portrait lenses that are really sharp in the center. The big optics are sharp in the center, and then they swirl and fall off to the edges. So those exposures with natural daylight, 1 to 3 seconds, just depending on the type of light I'm using, versus out If I'm stopped down to F8 or F16, if I'm doing some landscape, and sometimes I do the landscapes with that wider lens as well too. But I can get up into the minute, minute and a half, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute exposures. So you go from 1 or 2 seconds to 1 or 2 minutes, depending on, your scene, the light. We have a lot of UV here in Colorado. We're way up high. We don't have that pollution between, we have a lot of UV. I mean, we have the pop prints print out fast even in the shade, and the exposures are very fast. When you get above 10,000 feet here, it's very fast exposure. So, but huge difference in the Petzval lenses, wide open, versus the stop down kind of rapid rectilinear landscape lenses are minutes apart. Minutes.
So that should explain the head brace, Mary Lou. Even down to 1 second, we all know that fidgety person that probably couldn't hold still even for a 1 second exposure.
That's so true. And it's funny that what happens is even when you get in a head brace, and I feel like I can hold still for 1 or 2 seconds, but you'd be surprised. I had a neurologist take a workshop from me, and he told me that everyone has tremors, even to a slight degree. Young people are a little better than older people, but once you get past post 40 or so, you'll even have just a little tremor. So it's even 1 or 2 seconds, you can see movement. I mean, it doesn't take much. And if I'm photographing inside with a daylight window that's scrimmed and I'm using a bounce card, I might be 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, and you can definitely get movement in there. That's why you need that head brace.
Gotcha. And I think this is going to be the last question. And once that's done, we'll say goodbye. After we get in the stream, Quinn, stay on the line, and we'll wrap up with you. But the last question is from Mary Lou, and she writes, "What is next for you?"
What is next? Thank you for that question. That's always a great question to end on. Right now, we live in the metro area of Denver, Colorado. We live in a little suburb called Aurora. Denver's 20 minutes west of us. We have 12 acres of land in the mountains of central western Colorado. We started developing that a few years ago. And before the coronavirus hit, we had plans to build out a 30 by 80 building on our property and move there in June. And we still plan to do that, but our house is up for sale here. In that space that we're building, I'm going to have a daylight studio, North Daylight Studio. And the next thing for me, and this is tentative, but I hope to do this, is I want to make large 16 by 20 portraits again, negatives, wet collodion negatives, and I want to make oil prints, like I've been showing tonight, pigment prints of those portraits. And the content of those portraits will be working stiffs, will be blacksmiths, tradesmen, people that are working in, if I can find ranchers and cowboys, people that are working in professions or trades that are going away or that will be replaced eventually. And I want to make large contact oil prints, almost like paintings, portraits from these negatives. And I'd like to do a small body of work, which I want to call working stiffs, based on a book from about the 19th century occupations then. It kind of mimic that and do it very poetically that way in pigment prints. That's what I hope to do. So we'll see, depending on how this coronavirus plays out, and if we ever get back to any kind of normalcy and I can sell my house and do all that, that's the next step. That's what we'd like to do.
Now, if anybody in chat wants to buy your house, will you throw in a wet plate workshop?
That's awesome. I'd throw in 2 or 3 if you want to buy my house. Hey, Colorado's wonderful to live in. We've got a great place here. I've got a 1,800 square foot studio and dark room. I got plenty of space here, but it's just, I want to semi-retire, and I just don't want to live in the city anymore. I don't want to live in the masses anymore. And if there's anything that this coronavirus is showing me, it's exactly that. We want to be in the mountains. The mountains of Colorado, the Rocky Mountains are so beautiful. We have 12 acres up there, and it looks like it's, heaven on earth. It looks like a national park, and we just want to get up there and live. I hope I have another 20 or 30 years here, and if I do, I just want to be up there in peace and quiet, have our freedom, enjoy life. And I will say this, if this does happen, and anybody wants to come out to Colorado, we're going to hold 2 retreats a year when we get set up there. You can come up and work in the studio, do workshops. You can go to the forge and make blades. I'm a blacksmith and a bladesmith. I'll teach you how to make knives, teach you how to do blacksmith work. You can eat out of our greenhouse. You can just totally digitally detox, get away from the screens and the phones and the news and the nonsense, and just come up to the mountains and play in photography and handcraft and go hiking and go fishing and target shoot and all kinds of good stuff. Anything you want to do out there, that's our plan. So we'll see how that works out.
Wow, that sounds absolutely fantastic. Quinn, I wish you the best of luck. Everybody, please make sure you follow Quinn on Facebook. He's up
Thank
in
you
the
so much,
description.
everybody. I appreciate that.
Follow him on YouTube. Go to his website. Just keep an eye on Quinn because he's got a lot of great stuff in the past and a lot of great stuff coming. For next week, we will have our own Christine Milliker with a macro photography talk, and we'll have our new mixer. So even though you should have had good video, we did have some problems with audio at the beginning. That should be fixed next week. But I want to thank everyone for sticking around. Thank you so much, Quinn, for joining us and giving us 2 hours of your precious time. I'm sure everybody really loved the talk.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time, spending a little time in my world. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Just hold on, Quinn. We're gonna go to credits. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
Ciao.